Good afternoon, everyone. The conference will resume shortly, it is resuming right now. Thank you to everyone who's here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online, both now, but also later as well. My name is Vass Bednar. I run McMaster University's MPP in Digital Society program. I'm a Public Policy Forum Fellow. I'm a Senior Fellow with CG, and I write the newsletter Regs to Riches. I care a lot about competition reform broadly in Canada, and I've really been enjoying learning about all of your work. Thank you so much for it. However, I was not invited to speak about myself, though it's my #1 area of expertise. I'm here to introduce the conference's second keynote, Elettra Bietti. Elettra is a joint postdoctoral fellow at the NYU School of Law and the Digital Life Initiative at Cornell Tech in New York. Her research is on data law, antitrust law, and market regulation, and how that plays out in the platform economy. Elettra is affiliated to the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, to the Information Society panel at Yale Law School, as well as to the Information Society Law Center at the University of Milan. She sometimes, in the spare time she has left over from all of that, also advises and collaborates with civil society as well. And prior to her career in academia, she was a competition and intellectual property lawyer in London and Brussels, handling corporate transactions and patent disputes. Now, we've gone through a lot of numbers here together in this day and a half so far. And this project, this global project, is very much a numbers-driven analysis of media concentration and associated issues. But improving marketplaces is about so much more than just number grinding. The facts, they don't always speak for themselves. And this can be hotly contested territory as well, right? It's underpinned by different values, different visions, and different histories. Elettra recently wrote a short piece for CG, one of the conference's co-sponsors, that really rocks. It's called Antitrust's Crossroads. And in it, she addresses the tendency to overcreate a binary between the long reign of the Chicago School and empiricists and neo-Brandeisians. And given that competition or antitrust law is an entry point to think about the society that we want or that we hope to achieve, being thoughtful about the philosophy and the norms that shapes and clouds these conversations is absolutely critical, as is being able to bridge academic work with practitioner work and writing for a broader public audience, something I really admire. I'm going to make one last point that I fear might surprise Elettra, just to give you a rush before you come up to the stage. It's something I don't think she may disclose herself, and that's that she's on the academic job market. Now, from my perspective, I can't believe for a second that she's going to be on it for long, but I wanted to flag it for all the global scholars tuning in and who are here. You best get in touch with her ASAP. Once again, this scholar writes on technology law, privacy, and antitrust in the digital economy, focusing on how platforms like Google and Facebook shape our political consumption choices. Check out her forthcoming paper, Self-Regulating Platforms and Antitrust Justice. How's this all going to go down? I'm about to invite Elettra up. She's going to offer remarks for about 30 minutes, and Tommaso is going to have the first opportunity to respond to this rising star. Tommaso, I'm treating you as kind of a moon right now, and then we're going to open the floor to questions, and I'll be alternating from questions in the room to questions online. So I'm looking forward to those as well. Elettra, I'm glad you're here, and get on up. She's going to roam the stage with the microphone.
Okay, cool, it works. Thank you so much, Vass, for this amazing introduction. I am humbled by what you said. And interestingly enough, the piece that I wrote for CG talks about one form of duality, and this presentation is about another duality. So polarities rock. So Yes, so I don't think I'm saying anything new to this audience when I say that big tech companies like Google, Facebook, or Amazon are huge, very concentrated, very much talked about in the media, and raise lots of conundrums for lawyers, for policymakers in terms of how to rein in their power and how to regulate them. Next slide, please. And so one way in which debates on platform regulation crystallize in many cases is in terms of a trade-off between breaking up and regulating big tech. Next slide, please. So textbooks, economic textbooks, legal textbooks, tend to see antitrust and regulation as somehow bodies of law that are in opposition to one another. They tend to see antitrust as a body of law that decentralizes markets, and regulation, utility regulation, as something that is applied to centralized monolithic industries. They tend to see antitrust as associated to small business or the creation or the kind of disintegration of larger conglomerates of power, whereas regulation is a body of tools and strategies that are applied to large conglomerates of power so that they can stay in place. There's also a tendency to see antitrust as operating ex post, as enforced by courts in a case-by-case basis, whereas regulation operates ex ante in a structural and durable way. Next slide. Antitrust is, again, so these are all kind of potential polarities that we see coming across in books and the literature, both on law and other fields. So antitrust is seen as the law of competition, whereas regulation is often seen as the law of natural monopoly. And in some cases, antitrust is distinguished from regulation as a body of law that operates indirectly, that furthers the goals of competition and choice and innovation in an indirect way, whereas regulation operates directly to embed certain predetermined purposes in markets and productive systems. Next slide, please. So that distinction is commonly kind of thought to be true, and yet when one starts thinking about how antitrust and regulation operate, in particular in digital platform markets, such as the ones currently dominated by companies like Google or Facebook, one starts seeing that antitrust and regulation are actually not that distinct and are, in fact, really converging with one another. So we're seeing antitrust lawsuits in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere that increasingly are tackling and going to infrastructural questions and trying to impose structural remedies, or at least are seeking those remedies. We'll see if they're actually going to be imposed. Antitrust regulators are therefore thinking about the impact of antitrust in a kind of long-term, durable way, as if it were a form of regulation of markets. At the same time, we're seeing regulation that is no longer thought of as utility regulation that applies to monolithic, say, quasi-natural monopolies. But instead, we're seeing regulation that is pro-competitive, that is seeking to decentralize digital markets, regulating bottlenecks to enable competition. Next slide, please. So I'm currently working on this project about how these bodies of thought and of law and of strategic thinking in policy are actually converging and how we might think about their boundaries. And so as part of this project, I make 4 primary points or arguments. The first is that the distinction that we tend to make between antitrust and regulation is actually under pinned by a deregulatory bias. So we tend to think of antitrust as a body that in some way is more respectful to the autonomy and unregulated nature of competitive marketplaces, and of regulation as a body of law that is intrusive, that interferes with markets and with freedom. And therefore, we create this distinction that might be artificial. And so I argue for basically moving away from siloed thinking within kind of domains of law or policy, and for trying to instead integrate the functions of antitrust and regulation, and try to implement or use those tools to promote goals that might not otherwise be considered important or as having primacy within antitrust or within regulation. So instead of focusing on the consumer welfare standard, instead of focusing on certain notions of efficiency or output maximization within antitrust law, we might think of using the same tools that antitrust law provides us with to do things that might not have to necessarily do with consumer welfare or efficiency. The third point is, so once we've kind of taken apart these bodies of law, what do we do? How do we think about those goals of regulation? And so there, I think there is a real effort to be made on what is the public interest, what are certain specific digital markets for, so what is search for, what is advertising for, what is social media for, what are the needs that people have fulfilled through the existence of those markets, and what are the functions of those markets. And it's only by understanding what the actual or most essential functions of these markets might be that one can start designing proper solutions for somehow regulating or constraining the actions of private actors. And so finally, I think about this notion of consumer choice or consumer citizen choice as a way of potentially framing the normative debate and the complexity of determining those goals that we are trying to aim at when we regulate big tech. Next slide, please. So the roadmap for the rest of this half hour is I'll first talk a little bit more about the antitrust regulation polarity. I'll then use the case study of Google and how Google has been regulated between 1998 and 2022 to illustrate a kind of shift in how we're thinking about big tech companies today. I'll then propose a visual device for integrating or remapping the polarity between antitrust and regulation. I'll briefly discuss what difference integrating antitrust and regulation might make in practice. And then I will conclude with a reflection on 3 potential interpretations of consumer choice, what those interpretations might lead to in terms of policy. Okay, so next slide. So I think when we think about the antitrust regulation polarity, we can try and interpret the distinction in various ways. People might push back and say, oh, but actually we all know that antitrust and regulation are not different. They're all part of the same toolbox. It's just, for one reason or another, antitrust laws are separate in various legal regimes, and therefore that's why we distinguish them. But I think there are 2 stories that might justify the distinction. Next slide, please. The first story is a story that starts from a view of the internet as a lawless space. So in the beginning, there was lawlessness. The internet was decentralized, was a space of freedom, of permissionless innovation. And that is a vision that is can be found in many texts in the 1990s. I have cited on this slide John Perry Barlow's A Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, where the claim is really that cyberspace is a separate space that is immune or free from government law. And so the story would go, according to this kind of in the beginning, there was lawlessness story. Big tech begins as a very freedom-enhancing enterprise, and then grows into a very highly concentrated and potentially threatening conglomerates of power. And so the internet becomes centralized, enclosed, privatized, and potentially unfree or unemancipatory. And so what should regulators do now? Well, they can intervene in one of two ways. They can either say, we want to go back to the lawless, decentralized internet of the past. How do we do that? Well, with punctual antitrust interventions that re-decentralize and kind of create more competition in digital markets, or by trying to change course and structure digital markets with proactive, durable forms of regulation. And of course, this story is limited and problematic in many ways. The key one is that the internet was never lawless. And so there was always regulation from the start. So this dichotomy between antitrust and regulation fails to see that actually regulation is already there. And so it's no longer a question of whether we need antitrust or regulation, but what kind of intervention we might need today that we might not have needed in the past. And so I mentioned here several texts that early on in the 1990s already theorized the presence of law in digital spaces in various ways. Notably, Lawrence Lessig introduced this idea of the four modalities of regulation, explaining that code or social norms or markets are actually ways for the government to enforce its purposes on the internet. And so law is actually present, it's not absent from digital spaces. Next slide, please. So let's move on to the second story, which is, in my view, more compelling. And this story can be found or discovered in the texts on antitrust and regulation in the United States, at least, and I'm sure elsewhere too. And so antitrust and regulation are seen as different in two possible ways. And I think these two ways might not be incompatible. So the first is seeing antitrust and regulation as substitutes. So both antitrust and regulation promote or pursue similar goals that might have to do with lower prices for consumers, more outputs, more efficient production, more innovation, and other such goals. And yet antitrust and regulation operate differently. And so to quote Justice Breyer on this, Justice Breyer says, the antitrust laws set forth a few negatively phrased directives which are enforced by the courts or the FTC. They promote competition so that competition itself can bring us economic benefit. So the idea is antitrust is there to promote a sort of autonomous, decentralized process that is the competitive process. On the other hand, regulation operates directly to embed certain predefined purposes in markets, not digital markets, for him. And so regulation bypasses the competitive process. And it entails a whole administrative apparatus with agencies and networks of rules that determine prices or set rules for how markets are supposed to operate. So that's the view of antitrust and regulation are substitutes. They basically advance or promote the same purposes, and yet they do it in different ways. The complements view is slightly different. So Hovenkamp is an example of someone who thinks of antitrust and regulation as complementary, and he sees regulation as a residual regulator. Antitrust as a residual regulator. And he says, I think strikingly, antitrust takes the market's regulatory structure as given. So antitrust is more present or more needed when there is more deregulation. The more you deregulate the airlines industry, the more antitrust is necessary to kind of maintain a sort of healthy ecosystem of competition. So the less there is other law, the more antitrust is actually fulfilling its purpose. And so the idea is that in some circumstances, you might have regulation in some markets, and you might have competition and antitrust that are kind of complementary or that act together on several parts of the productive system. So that is at least Hovenkamp's view. Next slide. So I presented you with two stories of the dichotomy, and some of you might not be persuaded by either of them. Some of you might think that one of them is stronger than the other. I believe the second perspective is stronger and potentially compelling, but I still think that there is a problem with the second story or the second perspective, and that is that we or it takes competitive processes and their autonomy and their functioning as a sort of thing that exists outside of the regular operation of the law. And so antitrust is kind of a special body that is especially well suited to advance and enable competitive processes and allow them to operate in a kind of autonomous way in some shape or form. And other bodies of law are not like that, and other bodies of law actually interfere with competitive processes and are problematic and are regulation that we should think about and limit. And of course, that's potentially contestable in the sense that there are lots of bodies of law that actually enable competitive processes, and that goes from contract law to intellectual property law to property simply, and many other branches, or even employment law. Like all of these branches of regulation actually enable forms of competition, enable certain markets to exist. And so the question of what kinds of markets we want cannot be solved by trying to distinguish between a kind of healthy form of competition law or antitrust and a less welcome form of interventionist interaction or approach to law in markets, right? Okay, so next slide. So let's take the example of Google to illustrate what happened over the last approximately 20 years in digital regulation. So everyone knows Google. I'm not going to speak about Google for long, but Google was born in 1998, founded by Sergey Brin and Larry Page. It met a huge success thanks to its PageRank algorithm, which is an algorithm that allows basically all of us to search for content and find content that is relevant to us thanks to a system that ranks content based on how popular or how linked to it is on the internet. The motto of the company at its origins was "Don't be evil." The company's founders insist in their original papers on the PageRank algorithm and search engines that they do not want to rely on advertising because relying on advertising might be in conflict with offering a service that is actually helpful to consumers. And of course, that had to end at some point, and in the 2000s, this is covered by many people, Shoshana Zuboff most recently perhaps, in the early 2000s, the dot-com bubbles bursting led to economic pressures that led to Google and other tech companies having to show how they monetize their services, and so that's how surveillance advertising was born, and that's how the access to people, the access to eyeballs, the access to personal data has led to a system that fuels profits for big tech. Next slide, please. So I have been thinking about how the evolution of law in digital markets has played out quite a lot. And I think in this case, and thinking about the distinction or the relationship between antitrust and regulation, it's helpful to try and distinguish in two phases. I must say, though, that this is true mostly of the United States. As I show, it doesn't necessarily work for Europe, and I don't think it works for many other countries in the world. So I welcome any form of pushback. But I do think that for the US, it is broadly accurate that there are two phases The first one is a laissez-faire phase, which one could say ended very recently in 2020, perhaps, with the Antitrust House Committee report. And then there's a second phase that is a phase that started focusing more on infrastructural power and is more interventionist in digital markets. So the first phase is a phase where regulators had faith in the natural competitiveness of digital markets. And if they were aware that there was law in digital markets, they still thought there was no specific need for conscious legal intervention that actually disrupted them. Regulators and policymakers thought that we could trust big tech companies to actually bring about adequate levels of innovation and choice in digital markets. So big tech's interests were thought to be aligned with the interests of consumers and everyone else in the marketplace. And there was reluctance on the part of policymakers, in particular antitrust regulators, to intervene through other forms of regulation, not just antitrust, but also trying to combine privacy interventions or the regulation of content with questions of market regulation. So ultimately, the approach and the attitude was a very hands-off, we're not going to get involved in this attitude. The second phase is very different. It's a phase where regulators start realizing, wait, we've given far too much trust to these large gatekeepers, and in fact, their interests are not at all aligned with the interests of consumers and of society. So we need to actually make sure that those gatekeepers are acting in the interests of the people. How do we do that? We have to start intervening more boldly, both from an antitrust perspective and from a regulatory perspective. And so examples of these two phases, so in the US, you have famously the Google DoubleClick merger in 2007, which was, one could say, was cleared, but actually was just not investigated in full. There's the famous Google self-preferencing case that never went through. There are a few FTC investigations and kind of soft guidelines where the FTC said or told Google through letters addressed to Google that they had to make a difference or clearly distinguish for consumers between organic search results and paid search results. But that was pretty much it when it comes to the regulation of Google between 1998 and almost 2020. So that's a long period of time with Google doing what they wanted in digital markets. This has changed recently with the House Committee report on big tech and antitrust, with several cases against Google in the advertising sector, in the search sector. There's an upcoming new case that will be started, I think, on advertising against Google. There is also legislation that is being proposed in the United States. Who knows if the legislation is actually going to be passed. But the American Innovation Choice Online Act is particularly significant in that sense. And so just to kind of compare, let's look at the European case. The European case is a kind of hybrid case where we have lots of mergers that were cleared. The Google DoubleClick was cleared in 2008. The Google Motorola Mobility case was cleared, or the merger was cleared in 2012. The Google Fitbit case went to a phase 2 investigation and then was cleared. There were several antitrust investigations against Google that started in the early 2010s. And these investigations took many, many years to reach completion with mild success, allegedly, but I'm interested in what Tommaso might say after my talk. And then, of course, there is some significant progress in Europe before year 2020, when it comes to data protection regulation, the right to be forgotten, etc. So there was definitely movement in Europe before there was movement in the United States. And in Europe, there is also a second phase that is quite interesting, in particular with the Digital Markets Act, which is really significant and ambitious when it comes to ex-ante decentralizing regulation that seeks to promote competition in digital markets. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is broadly, both in the US and in Europe, a convergence between antitrust efforts that are increasingly bold and increasingly trying to tackle infrastructural power, and regulation that is increasingly interested in decentralizing marketplaces and achieving competition. Next slide, please. So to help kind of remap this evolution and this convergence, I use a chart. Next slide, please. So I map antitrust and regulation efforts along two axes. The x-axis goes from decentralizing to centralizing efforts, and the y-axis goes from ex-ante to ex-post efforts. And so one might think, according to traditional textbooks and law textbooks, that antitrust is on one side of the spectrum of in one quadrant, the top left quadrant, and utility regulation, which is one form of economic regulation, is on the bottom right quadrant. And they're very distinct. They have different remedies. Of course, utility regulation is much more interventionist and seeks to regulate market entry and exit, access. It imposes non-discrimination obligations on regulated actors, and also often sets rates and prices. Next slide, please. And so what we're seeing is really an evolution of both antitrust and regulation towards the left bottom quadrant, so towards the ex-ante decentralizing quadrant. So both antitrust is becoming increasingly structurally focused and ex-ante in its aims and in its goals, and the remedies that are being at least sought and eyed by antitrust regulators are increasingly about long-lasting restructuring of industries, of the digital industry. And at the same time, we have regulation that is ex-ante but decentralizing. So I think this is a finding in itself, and I think it's not a finding by me, by all means, but I think it's really interesting to pause and think about this, and whether this was actually there all along, and whether this is specific to the digital industry, or whether this is actually something that can be noticed across industries, whether this tells us something about the inexistence of a real dichotomy between antitrust and regulation. But anyway, I'll leave you with these questions and move to the next slide. So let's look at a few cases where the integration of antitrust and regulation really makes a difference. Next slide. So on Google search, which I talked about, in the 2010, 2013 search preferencing, self-preferencing case, the FTC did not go through with the case, and the reason is that to show a Section 2 offense under the Sherman Act, the FTC should have proved an intent to exclude competitors from their search engine, and proving the intent to exclude was really difficult for the FTC to achieve, and so that's one of the main reasons why the case was dismissed. And today, that hurdle would not be present in a case against Google on self-preferencing, because, of course, if new legislation is passed, it would be possible to prove or to say that self-preferencing per se is a problem, and there would be no need to prove intent to exclude or any other complicated factual case to be made by the FTC. So that's a potential difference that integrating some regulation with traditional antitrust enforcement might make. Next slide. Another difference, of course, would be cases like the Google DoubleClick merger would potentially be decided differently if privacy were considered a relevant consideration in merger control today. And this is not necessarily only in the US, but I think in other places as well. So in the sort of decision of the FTC at the time in 2007, they said that privacy was not a relevant consideration. And so even though it was quite clear that there were privacy implications that were raised by the merger, that was not something that antitrust regulators were or had to be concerned with. If we start thinking about regulation as a spectrum, as something that is more integrated, privacy considerations automatically start creeping into the antitrust analysis. There is no longer a specific reason why antitrust regulators need to dismiss privacy or the privacy implications of digital mergers. Next slide, please. And so one kind of implication of integrating antitrust and regulation is potentially making a difference to antitrust law and how it operates and making antitrust law bolder and more effective. The other potential implication of integrating antitrust and regulation, which is perhaps what I am focusing on in this project, is really just trying to remap remedies and how to use them in various different ways. And so as I'll explain, it's not just that we're gravitating towards the ex-ante decentralizing quadrant of the framework, but in fact that most remedies that are being used by regulators in digital markets and across other industries are not neatly mapped into silos and could be used to pursue a variety of goals and ends. And so that finding prompts us to rethink our methodologies and rethink how we're thinking about law and regulation in digital markets. Next slide. Next slide. So in the paper that I'm talking about, I present a methodology that I consider to be a pragmatic methodology influenced by the work of Tim Scanlon, who's a philosopher, and John Dewey, who's also a philosopher, a pragmatist philosopher. And the approach is to take both the procedural aspects and the substantive questions about values as uncertain and as subject to deliberation and reflection. And so there's a question of means of regulation. What remedies do we have available? What remedies do we need to tackle a specific problem? And then there's a question of substantive ends of regulation. What is the value that we want to pursue? What are the needs that those markets are supposed to advance? And the question of means and remedies cannot be answered without specifying the goals and the ends of regulation. And the question of ends cannot necessarily be defined without figuring out what are the ways in which we can act, what are the feasible, possible ways that are available to regulators for actually implementing those values. If the values are unimplementable, then probably they're not the right values to pursue. But I think this method, which is reflective in some ways, actually helps us, thank you, actually helps us potentially be a little bit bolder than what we currently can do with the existing kind of siloed legal frameworks that we have available. And that's because if there is a value that's particularly important, but really hard to achieve with the tools that are commonly available to a policymaker, then maybe it's time to think about a new approach or a new remedy. On the other hand, it might be possible to rethink some of the remedies that we already have available and potentially combine them with other remedies from different doctrines or domains to try to achieve certain values or certain goals that we are already pursuing, but in more effective ways. So it opens up the possibilities, I believe. Next slide. And so one way of illustrating this approach, and then I'm practically done, is by looking at three possible conceptions of consumer choice in digital markets. So the first conception is what I call choice as negative freedom. And it's really the conception of the early internet where regulators were hands off. I don't want to touch big tech. I'm just going to let them do what they want to do because their interests are really aligned with the interests of consumers. Another way of calling this vision might be the choice as volume of transactions vision, which is ultimately what we care about is that advertisers, users, publishers, or producers of content engage in as much profit-making activity as possible so that more money flows in the economy and everyone's better off. Someone else will take care of redistributing that wealth, but ultimately we're happy if big tech actors are increasing the possibilities for transactions in the economy, and that's really what we're pursuing. And that view is, I think, crystallized well in the Ohio against Amex American Express case in the US, which pertains to the credit card market, but is really about, it doesn't matter that we give more options to merchants to shift from Amex to other card providers as long as the default Amex payment method incentivizes consumers to engage in more and more transactions. And so ultimately we're pursuing or we're advancing the interests of society because more transactions are being made, more money is flowing, and so that's good even though there are less options for shifting from one provider to the other. The second vision is the choice as contestability vision, and that's really what the DMA or the ACOA, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, are pursuing, and that's the idea that consumers should be able to switch from one provider to the other. So it's okay to let private actors define and build infrastructures for the internet, but it's important to let users choose very radically between various forms of infrastructure. And the final view that I believe is kind of in opposition with a lot of the policy and regulatory efforts that we're seeing today is to stop thinking of choice as something to always promote and think of choice as something that needs to be conditioned properly. So it is good to have the choice as a consumer, but only when we are in the right circumstances, when we're enabled to make choices that are ultimately good and valuable for ourselves. And so there might be circumstances where less choice is actually preferable to more choice. And so in that sense, I think one can start questioning even this convergence of antitrust and regulation towards the kind of bottom left quadrant of ex-ante decentralizing competition, because ultimately the values at stake as part of all these moves are really, we want more decentralization, we want more choice, we want more competition, we want more innovation, but nobody's really asking why, what is it that consumers need from these digital ecosystems. And so I hope that trying to remap the remedies and the purposes of regulation beyond antitrust and regulation doesn't just help us reframe a current state of affairs, but also might help us move beyond it and think, what are the gaps in the current directions that we're taking? Maybe they're good directions, but maybe there's something that's still missing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are at about 2:20 Eastern. We're going to go till about 2:45. That gives us 25 juicy minutes together to chat. Tommaso, I'd love to turn it to you first for some reactions or questions, just a bit of a dialogue together, and then I'm going to head straight to the Q&A that's coming up in the chat, and then I'll bring it back here on the floor.
Sure.
Tommaso, welcome back.
Thank you, thank you. So my first reaction is, wow, what an amazing keynote by Elettra. It's such an honor and a pleasure to listen to her, and it's so reassuring also to see this younger generation of superstars that are doing an amazing job. So fantastic, well done. A couple of comments, just reacting live to what Elettra said. First, I want to say that what she's doing is incredibly important because our attempts to regulate the big tech across the world should not be seen as a fait accompli. So it's still a very critical moment. I don't know. Europe, yes, has a DMA, but implementation is going to be key. So how to do that is remains to be seen. The antitrust bills, we hope they will go through, but we are not there yet. So there is really a very important last mile that we need to cover. And so the type of things that Elettra is making us reflect upon are really utterly, utterly important. A few, reaction to what she said. First, on this relationship between antitrust and regulation that we've been discussing for many years. In the UK, by the way, they try to square the circle by having a regime of so-called concurrent powers. So there are sectoral regulators such as Ofcom for telecoms, the FCA for the financial market, but they also apply a competition law under specific circumstances. So there is really a complementarity there. They are not substitutes. The additional elements that would be interesting if a person like Elettra could think about, also because I'm very pragmatic as a practitioner, sometimes I'm missing a little bit a notion of the skills which are required to do these two different activities. So a sort of resource-based view of institutions and enforcers, because they're made of slightly different people, and also a political view of it. So although yesterday, for instance, we were saying that we are concerned when it comes to antitrust of revolving doors, but historically, and I don't have any. I don't want to single out any particular regulator, but historically, and the economics also is telling us that regulators are more subject to influence activity and lobbying because they always have the same repeated clients, right? They always deal with the same companies over and over again. And instead, competition authorities, one day they do cement, then they do steel, then they do big tech. So it's less likely that they get captured. And this is a big problem when it comes to big tech because of the resources that these companies have. So I wonder whether, even if, I said yesterday, I very much favor regulation from this perspective, I don't have a concern. There is also perhaps a cultural element that I wonder whether it is something deeper than just observing that in Europe, for instance, we have a general tendency to accept regulation much more than the United States, and it would be good to see why fundamentally there may be these differences in approaches of society towards regulations versus antitrust enforcement. A theme in Elettra was this two phases of approaches to Google. The laissez-faire versus the infrastructure. One way to rationalize it is just because of the economics. Obviously, initial phase of dynamic competition in the market, so you want to stay out, and then when the monopolization, when dominance, when abuse happens, you want to intervene. I also wonder, and I would be intrigued to. She doesn't have to respond, whether on top of this kind of supply side change, technology changes, the economic changes, and therefore institutions react, there is also a demand from society which has changed. So something which is definitely true in recent years has been how much more central in the political discourse the regulation of these platforms have been. Think of Senator Warren, think of Amy Klobuchar. So some people talk about thin political markets. So thin political markets are the processes through which some of our very complex and critical institutions are in our capitalistic system are determined. So it can be obviously antitrust, it can be regulation, it can be accounting standards, infrastructure. So in these thin political markets, everything is left to the experts, okay? To the economists, to the lawyers. But this is never getting into the agenda of a political party or a movement because it's very thin, it's very narrow. Leave it to the experts. We're going to do it, and we're going to do it according to a technocratic approach. And I belong to that tradition. And then we have seen the results. And now distinct political markets have burst. You have much more push from civil society to get into there. So I wonder whether also it's our. So I tend as an economist to think about demand and supply for institutions. So there is a demand for a certain type of institution that we didn't have in the past, that now is starting because we are changing as a society. So we cannot just leave it to the experts. We also need to engage with citizens in a different way. The last point that I will make, and it was the last point also of Elettra's presentation, which I really liked, which is about choice, and I'm particularly intrigued about choice as a representation. Indeed, that's a fascinating concept. And this is where I would like to understand something I cannot articulate well. I'm just an economist, but I always have the feeling that when it comes to big tech, we are very reductionist. So intellectual is not, so we're always thinking about more apps, advertisers, maybe publishers, a digital platform, but the narrative is always within a perimeter which is very, very narrow. And I think and I don't know how to get to this process of having of having this happen, this idea of Elettra, of having this happen when, for instance, more information, the economy will say is always good, but sometimes it may even be bad. You don't want to have information about us being diffused. So what I have in mind, and I don't know how to express it other than a simple example, is that we are currently obsessed with Google and Facebook and others, maybe for good reasons. Obviously, they have a big impact on us and our societies. But I would like to understand how we can step back and for a second forget about Google and Facebook and sit down together with different views, with opposing views even, and try to figure out what we think. So it's not the values of the enforcers, but it's our values. First, the enforcers are representing ourselves. So how can we think about our digital future, forgetting the Google and Facebook, how we communicate, how we purchase, how we get our information? Our lives are so much dependent on these platforms. And when we get there on what we think our digital future may look like, maybe we can come up with an answer about our digital presence. So we don't need to. Of course, there will be Google and the Facebook. We know that, but we don't need to depend on them. And so that's why I'm asking: can we forget about that moment in order to be bolder? And you said you would like to be bold. So thank you, Elettra.
Thank you, Tommaso. We're getting a round of applause again. Yes. Do you mind if I jump to the next comment and then I'll let you respond?
Sure.
Or do you want to respond right now? What's your vibe?
I can respond or I can wait. I don't mind. Maybe I'll respond.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much for these comments. So I thought, so the demand side, so I guess there are two questions in your comments, but if there are more, I'm happy to go back to it after. So I think on the demand side point and kind of the evolution of the needs of the people, I think that's really interesting. And because we're in a media concentration conference, I kind of want to put it back to the media and say, there's a part of people's perceptions and needs that is constructed by information that is accessible to them. And so there is a possible story that could be told, and I think has been at least mentioned by a few people, which is that the media has interests that are directly conflicting with the interests of big tech. And so it's possible that some of the hatred for big tech that is rampant today has been constructed also by big headlines and, kind of scapegoating of, big tech is bad for us and it's always Facebook's fault, when actually it wasn't necessarily Facebook's fault. for, I don't know, election results or other things, right? So I think there might be something there about how people's needs and tastes and claims have evolved. And that's basically what I'm trying to get at is I don't think that people's choices and needs are a kind of inherent autonomous thing that is separate from the society that we live in. And so the way people think about their needs and what kind of digital economy they want also comes from the information they have access to and all sorts of other factors, which ties into the second point, I think, which is about how do we think about values and needs if we kind of stop thinking about heuristics about innovation. We need more apps, we need more products, we need more choices, we need to be able to switch with less friction to different alternatives and things like that. And so I think there are a few things I want to say about this. So one thing is I don't think we can posit an ideal of what society needs independent from the tech that we already have. Because the tech we already have constructs, is a socio-technical affordance that shapes the kinds of needs and choices that we have today. And so we can't just remove the tech from the ecosystem and say, okay, let's just reinvent the world without the tech that we have. I don't think that's a possible way of thinking about it. But the way that I have been thinking about this problem and the limits of sectoral regulation like the DMA is kind of related to work that I've done on neoliberalism and ordoliberalism. And I think, there are some great things about the ordoliberal perspective that is pretty much dominant, I would say, in the European Union's efforts. But there are also some huge limitations, and those limitations, I think, start from a faith in individuals as ultimate decision makers. We need to give people more choice because they're the ultimate decision makers in markets. It's not okay to delegate those choices to others. It's not necessarily a good thing to allow users to collectively organize in digital spaces independent from the controller-dominant role of big tech infrastructure providers. We don't need that ability to organize horizontally because ultimately it's all a matter of individual choice and individual exercise of freedoms. And I think that's the problem. I think that's what I mean by a different conception of choice. I think we can't just conceive of an economy as a set of vertical relations between an entrepreneur or a private provider that determines what products are good for people and tries to sell them, and then the interaction with a consumer that decides to buy the product and therefore tell the entrepreneur that their idea was good because actually there is demand for it. I think there's also a process whereby we need to make collective decisions about what kinds of product might be good for entrepreneurs to develop and what kinds of products might not be good for entrepreneurs to develop. And that's something that regulators have done for a long time, like the FDA controls what kinds of drugs are available on the market, or there are drugs that you can get over the counter and other drugs that you cannot get over the counter. And so the government takes care of some of those choices, but I think there is so much space for elaboration and thinking around how do we delegate those choices to groups of people? How do we empower people other than individuals to shape markets in new ways? So that's how I've been thinking about it.
Lots to elaborate on. Let me pick up on that and just share, something that stuck out for my mind as a sort of practitioner, policy thinker is that's very resonant from your presentation. Often when competition issues are brought up in some of my own work, and I'm using a lowercase w for work there, people will say, well, you know what? Well, that's actually not competition because it's not exactly in the Competition Act. So it's actually not a competition issue. And that's actually healthy and like has led to interesting discussions. But to me, that's some of what you're saying in that presentation, where as you know, policy people, how do we find and build the tools to potentially intervene on competition adjacent or competition related issues that might not necessarily be perfectly adherent to that core legislation? And our first question from our audience comes in kind of hot on the heels of that. So comes from Tahira Dawood from PIAC. Thank you so much. Thanks you for your presentation. Expresses a keen concern. Some critics, this is a very Canadian context, so now we're zooming down, we're making it local, seem to be downplaying the role of privacy in the antitrust framework or as relevant for antitrust frameworks. Can you please elaborate on what might be the best method for integrating privacy in the competition framework? And I hear and read and offer that question as how can Canadians, with this upcoming review of the Competition Act, so a narrow reviewing a specific piece of legislation, how can we have a broader and better conversation about competition, the markets we want, the lives we want to have? And yeah, just like very quickly, tell us how to do that.
Yeah, great. Easy. So I actually think that many of you might have better answers than I do on this, but I mean, I think there are lots of different ways of doing it. So in relation to the Google DoubleClick merger that I was talking about, or many other mergers that have followed that merger, one could imagine at least two different ways of kind of integrating privacy considerations. One is maybe three possible ways. I'm just kind of, you know, and you could go more or less granular. One way is you introduce a sort of step as part of the regulatory scrutiny and merger review that an antitrust regulator needs to go through. There are steps, and some of them have to do with market definition and market share definition and whatever else. And then there is a step which is impact on privacy. Tell us, you know, how much data do you collect and what kinds of, I don't know, activities do you carry out based on data, and, you know, some sort of impact assessment as part of that. So that's one way of doing it. Another potentially kind of combinable thing to do is to embed a privacy specialist within antitrust policymakers' units. Another way of doing it, which I think has been an approach that has been at least considered by the European Union, I'm not sure where that is right now, is this idea of a clearinghouse where many different regulators come together and discuss cases with one another. So you could have, say, the Data Protection Authority that talks to the antitrust regulator, either regularly, not necessarily on one case, but more generally to share knowledge. Or they could, you know, you could envisage a sort of joint procedure where if there are privacy issues, you need to start kind of a joint procedure with the Data Protection Authority. And so that's something that has been done. And maybe another possibility, and I'm not choosing between them because I think it really depends on context and is a very case-by-case question, and here we have specialists from all countries, and so I think the answer really depends on the country and the specifics of the culture, etc. But for example, in the UK, there is a kind of more specialized, you know, digital regulator that thinks about all issues in relation to certain technologies, and there you could have, you know, mergers go directly to them, which is a kind of like an FCC approach to regulation of big tech platforms or other technologies. I'm not sure I buy that approach. So if you ask me like what my opinion is, I think the economy is such an integrated thing that having different units for different technologies is completely artificial. So although I like the integration approach, I don't necessarily like the by technology division idea.
Understood. I'm going to bring it to questions on the floor. I think I can probably take two. Why don't you guys get up to the microphone? We'll take both questions together, and then we'll have Elettra answer them. And I also want to offer, Canada, in recent amendments to the Competition Act, added consumer privacy as a consideration of, when considering the implications of competition. Remains to be seen how we're actually going to interpret that, but I think it is a positive step forward. And to hear it, thank you again for your question and for bringing it up. I'll ask for both questions because we have 6 minutes, so I'd like both of them at the same time, and then I'd like you to tag team that. Thank you so much.
So just a quick comment on this, how do you deal with things like privacy? Well, and I think a nice way that's consistent with what I'm hearing from you, antitrust law, then your sector specific, and remember that from the history of common carriage regulation, privacy, or telecoms regulation, privacy is a fundamental principle embedded within that regulation. So I think that offers us a model to think about a dedicated a sector-specific regulator for digital platforms, for example. All right, so that way it's there on an ex-ante basis. All right, and that's just my point.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be longer.
I still have time that I'm keeping my eye on. So I've given you the guidance, and you can do whatever you like with that guidance.
Okay, so I thought the talk was in a way and we've all been there, which is we're making a really good point about the present and interesting and intelligent observations. But that's not enough because we also have to show that the past has been wrong. And that starting point of yours, I have a problem with. The starting point basically being there was antitrust and there was regulation, and the two were either there were or they were seen as a dichotomy, as a polarity and whatever. And that is simply not correct. They were always seen as they came from the same historic period in the United. My examples would always be kind of US now. They came from the same period in the 1880s or so, and then kind of renewed in the 1910s or so. Historically, they were always seen as different tools for the same goal. And in fact, in reality, they were always integrated. Take the AT&T divestiture, which was an antitrust case, but immediately it moved to not just to the Judge Green, for the implementation, but also to the FCC and to the state utility commissions for the actuality of making this actually happen. So the two are not dichotomous. And conversely, there will be examples in which regulation led to even self-divestiture. If the Securities and Exchange Commission kind of declares, or the Glass-Steagall Act declares that you have to, an investment bank cannot be a commercial bank, then the banks will just split themselves.
May I ask if you'll be directing a question, or maybe should you both follow up following this presentation so that Elettra can consider your feedback for future presentations?
Well, but I'm basically saying that the kind of the initial point, which is that we have to integrate, has always existed. The integration exists. Now we can discuss how in the context of today's Google and other issues, this integration should happen. But we're not inventing the concept of integration.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. Shall I?
We've got 3 minutes, and we have one more question from the floor. Why don't we jump to a next question?
Okay.
Really appreciate the presentation, giving me at least a lot of ideas to think about. One quick comment is, I think your presentation is trying to invite us to question our assumptions. Our assumptions about, for instance, choices are always good or bad. More choices are good or bad. Rethink about transactions are more transaction, more productivity, for example. And yesterday, I think Ellie also mentioned, is more diversity better or worse? And so I'm wondering, how do we think about these different kinds of hierarchies of needs or hierarchy of good? If one is in contradiction with the other, what would you put on the top? For example, public interest versus transactions, right? And you could have more political as transactions that are horrible to elections, to our democracy. So do we have to think about sort of hierarchy of good or hierarchy of needs for people, for individuals, for our society? Thank you.
Okay, great questions. I think Dwayne's question was more a point, so I'll just take it and think it's useful. So Eli or Ellie, I think everything you say is something that I've been thinking about for a really long time, so it doesn't come to me as kind of at all a critique of what I'm doing, but rather a kind of, there is a historical perspective. I think part of my work in this project in particular is really a reaction to the 1980s neoliberal turn and the Chicago School framing of antitrust and regulation, which, okay, so one thing to say is if you look at the Google story, the kind of the evolution of efforts against Google that I talk about in the presentation, I think you see that the first phase, the laissez-faire phase, is deregulatory both from the antitrust and the regulation perspective. And the second phase, which is the infrastructural phase, is not necessarily super regulatory, but more regulatory from both the antitrust and the regulation perspective. So I think it's completely fair to say that the two are actually kind of operating in tandem, that they're, even the idea that they're complementary, which is something that Herbert Hovenkamp theorizes or talks about, doesn't necessarily portray them as opposites, right? It just portrays them as different. And I guess that what I'm trying to get at in this project is more the deregulatory bias that exists in the separation between antitrust and regulation, rather than saying antitrust and regulation are thought to be different historically or for some other good reason, and we're going to actually argue against that dichotomy. I think what I want to try and say is actually antitrust from the very start was just regulation, maybe a form of regulation that was, structured or channeled through particular antitrust laws that were discrete and recognizable. And so it made it easier for people to say, this is antitrust and this is all the rest. And then when it came to, Posner and Bork and other scholars who wanted to argue against the intervention and enforcement of law in markets, it was very easy to say, well, antitrust might be better because we can kind of theorize it as something that is less interventionist, and regulation in general and law is something that we should push back against. But maybe you disagree, I don't know. But that would be my response. So I'm not disagreeing with you on the history, and I'm not disagreeing with you. And actually, the paper had a section which was about the common roots of antitrust and regulation, and then the kind of later history and ways in which this dichotomy has been at least emphasized in wrong ways. Sorry. And then the last question, hierarchies of the good. I think that's basically a question about philosophy in general. That's what philosophers do. So I think what I try, basically what I'm arguing as part of this presentation is we need to do more philosophy instead of assuming that regulation is pursuing goals that only economists understand, and instead say, what else should markets do?
Thank you, everyone, for your attention, for your constructive feedback and reactions and your questions. Thank you, Tommaso, for being our respondent, and thank you, Elettra, for your provocative presentation. This now concludes our second keynote. Thank you again.
So we're just going to push the schedule back 10 minutes. We're down one presenter in the next panel, which just happens to kind of fortuitously open us up some space to accommodate the extra time we took here, which was extremely valuable. Thank you.